Well, I first got involved with the Quran because my grandfather, my father's family had lived in India for 3 generations. My grandfather lived in a Burmese hill station called Mamio, and he was a headmaster. So I had that in my background. And then as a Christian, I heard about the plight of the Karen living under the military junta and of their efforts to achieve an independent homeland, which they had been doing for some 60 years, ever since the Second World War, when they'd been promised, they said, by British officers, that in return for fighting with the Allies against the Japanese, the British would help them to achieve their own homeland. Unfortunately, as we all know, independence happened rather fast after the Second World War, as it did in India, and not much, these promises were never kept. After my first visit there, I founded a small charity. I was living in Brussels. I was at the Kwai River Christian Hospital, and I met my first old soldier, and he was called Mr. Joshua, or So Yoshu. And he was very poor, very thin, living with his mentally disabled daughter. And I asked him what I could do for him. And he spoke perfect English, and he said, "I'd like you to inform my officers." And I didn't change my expression, although I was thinking, how can I do that? I promised I'd try, went back to the UK, got in touch with the British Legion, who put me in touch with the Royal Commonwealth Ex-Services League, went to speak to Colonel Sam Pope, who acted on what I said very handsomely and came out to the Thai-Burma border and travelled around Burma and ended up, after a couple of years, with 4,000 old soldiers and widows on his books, all of whom were then receiving a grant. And I thought, well, great, my job's done. That's it. What a result. This is wonderful. Only to find a few years later that the grants to the old soldiers in the refugee camps and widows had been discontinued. So at that point we set up Help for Forgotten Allies to make sure that they continued to get their grant money. And that was in 2007, and now it's 2014. I go out in what they call the cool season because it's pleasanter for Europeans to travel at that time of year. So I visit people I trust and people I've known over quite some years, and we go to the refugee camps, which isn't necessarily a given because the Thais like to keep Europeans out. And then I see the old soldiers and the widows, and a lot of them I've got to know over the years. Last time I was visiting one, Anna Dwemong, and I said, what else could we do for you? Because we'd given him his £120 in Thai baht and gifts of milk and soup and soap and shampoo and toothpaste and all sorts of stuff. And I said, what else could we do for you? And he said, no, just that you come and visit every year. And then we went back to the office at the Karen Refugee Committee, and a phone call came through. His son actually wanted a bit of help repairing his roof, which would cost £60 before the monsoon season, because their roofs are made of leaves. I take money out of a cash point, and then I take it in with me, because obviously in the refugee camps they're really cut off. So I take in the cash, give it to them in cash, into their hands. And I think that's a good principle, to give them and their families the right to decide what they do with their money and not be too controlling about it. It's to honour them. It's to honour what they did in the Second World War and their sacrifice, as Vera Lynn has said. She's our patron. So they all get the same amount. Well, for me, Seagram is a big hero. I almost think of him as a saint, and I am a practicing Christian. And yeah, I think he was a wonderful man. All the accounts of him say how cheerful he was and how smiley he was, but actually he went through a hellish situation. He was the only man left, only European left, I think apart from a French Catholic priest, in Karen State when the British retreated to India. He was left behind as special forces, and his role was to get out information about what the Japanese were up to the Allies in India. And he lived with the Karen for a long time, just on his own. He was very fond of them, very devoted to them. And he made them promises that if he survived the war, he'd come back as a missionary. That's what he wanted to do. And he was sent off to the Karen Hills to recruit what they called levies. And indeed, he recruited 3,000 very fast. They were all really keen to join up. And then he was hidden by the Karen, and his contact in Yangon was getting information to him which he was passing on to the British. And the Japanese realised that somebody was getting information out. So they sent a group of soldiers and spies, the Karen called them, up to Karen State to find him. And they began looking for him. They began questioning the Karen, and they began torturing the Karen. Saw Burney, whose interview I was watching, Mark Fenn's interview with Saw Burney, he talked about how he'd seen an elderly man in a village strung up by his feet, dying, and having water forced into his mouth. Horrible Japanese torture methods. And when Seagram got wind of this, he decided he wasn't going to allow this to happen. He wasn't going to let the Karen be tortured. So he gave himself up. And I've met veterans who knew him who are still agonising about it, say, oh, he didn't need to give himself up. We would have gone on hiding him. They're still thinking about that. He gave himself up, and he was taken off to a horrible jail in Yangon, and he got dysentery and skin diseases and every last bugs and lice and all the rest of it. But according to the Japanese, who called him the Big Master, he was still smiley-faced, as the Karen said. And apparently, when he was taken out to be executed with some of his Karen, he said to them, "Come on, boys, let's be brave about this. Let's sing." And so they sang their last hymn together. And then some versions will have it that he was beheaded as the leader and the Karen soldiers were shot. And some versions will have it that they were all shot. But they were made to dig their own graves before that.